Good afternoon and welcome to the All Energy Decarbonised webinar series. I am Peter Blore, the Event Director for All Energy, and I would like to start proceedings by thanking everyone who has joined us today for this session on corporate PPAs, broadening the discussion. We're delighted that you can join us for our 17th webinar of the All Energy webinar series and our final September session. We've achieved nearly 11,000 registrations throughout our All Energy webinar series, which is tremendous support from the industry. So thank you for your ongoing support. Now, it's important to note that all the sessions will be available to view afterwards via the All Energy website and webinar channel. So please share the webinars and slides with those who you feel will benefit. In fact, all of our webinars are available via the link shown on the slide that I believe you'll be able to see now. And prior to the start of this session, I must encourage everyone in the audience to interact with our speakers as much as possible. You can do that via voting in the polls and asking live questions. So to actually vote in the polls, you will need to minimize your screen if you're watching in full screen mode. And to provide our team with feedback, please rate this session in the tab below and insert your comments alongside your rating. Now, we have slight technical issues. We're absolutely delighted that John Grady, a partner at Shepherd and Wedderburn, our headline sponsors, will chair this session and introduce the panelists and join us shortly. But I would, hugely thankful to John for that and our panelists for taking the time to join us today. However, I will be passing over now to Andy Payman, who's joining us from EDF Energy. So Andy, thank you for joining us, and really appreciate that. And we hope John will be able to join us very shortly as well.
Okay, thank you very much, and hi everyone. So I'm Andy Payman. I manage our structuring and origination team within EDF Energy. So within EDF, we contract with many renewable generators, so we're very active in the PPA market. We're also a supplier, so we're also active in helping customers meet their low carbon needs. A lot of them are doing that through corporate PPAs, which is why we're here today. So I'm going to spend 10 minutes just looking through the history of corporate PPAs, how we've got to where we've got to, very much from a customer's perspective. So first of all, just taking a step back and looking at the energy supply industry, it was very much set up such that there wasn't an awful lot of connection and transparency between electricity consumers and power generators. So electricity suppliers traditionally sit in the middle of that relationship, purchase power through wholesale trades or through own assets, and sell that power on to electricity consumers. Traditionally, the electricity consumers haven't really been that concerned with where their powers come from. In fact, they're more concerned with the supplier that they purchase it from. But we've seen a trend emerge over the last few years where customers are looking for more transparency. So customers are taking much more interest in where their power comes from. And at the same time, we've seen generators take a lot more interest in where their power is going to. And here there's different reasons from both sides of the market. So at the top with customers, customers are becoming more environmentally aware. Their customers are becoming more environmentally aware. So they want to know where their power comes from in the same way that they want to know where other goods come from in their supply chain. And at the same time, renewable generators are looking for those closer, longer term relationships with customers, usually as to secure that route to market, to secure a firm price. And this is becoming more and more prevalent with the emergence, with the removal of subsidies. So we've got two things: the emergence of net zero and carbon ambitions, and generators wanting to secure that fixed price. So in a way, it's good timing for both sides. And so when customers are looking to purchase renewable power, there's lots of different ways they can do it, but we can broadly break these down into three categories. There are private wire arrangements where the consumer connects itself directly to a generator, to a renewable generator. But these are fairly limited in that you need to have available land near to a large area of consumption. So whilst there are plenty of these deals going on, they're fairly limited in terms of their scale. Corporate PPAs are a lot more flexible, so you have that direct link, that direct contract between the consumer and the generator, but because the power transports through the grid via a supplier, they're much more flexible, which is one of the reasons why we've seen quite a large uptake over the last few years in corporate PPAs and continue to do so. But we shouldn't forget standard supply. And what I mean here is, when I talk of standard supply, I mean standard renewable supply, where customers are supplied REGO back power from their supplier. And the model, the kind of, going back to my earlier slides, that kind of model of separation is prevalent here, where the supplier acts as an aggregator, goes out and contracts with many renewable generators, takes the power, takes the certificate, and then bundles that up and sells that on to customers. And that's been the traditional route to purchase renewable power, and is still the most popular route to buying renewable power. But certainly in terms of headlines, in terms of what you see in the media, there's plenty out there in corporate PPAs, and it's the corporate PPAs that are more and more hitting the headlines. And I've just did a quick Google search a couple of days ago, typed corporate PPA UK into Google, and there's plenty of headlines out there. So there's plenty of deals that have been done over the last 12 months, even during lockdown. So Nestle in the top left there, Tesco in the bottom right, who are on the panel today. But as well as deals that are being done, there are plenty of others in the pipeline. So again, over the last few months, there's a number of organizations who have come out and declared the fact that corporate PPAs is a key part of their strategy, and are also coming to the market in tenders as well. So although COVID and lockdown has perhaps put a temporary pause to some of this work, it's certainly we're certainly seeing evidence that it's up and running again and gaining momentum. From an EDF perspective, we've been involved as other suppliers have in a number of corporate PPA arrangements, and from a customer perspective, when corporate PPAs are signed, they're good deals. There are good deals that give the customer a lot of benefits, especially in its quest for sustainability and its zero carbon messaging. So I've called out a few here. So corporate PPAs are seen to be more authentic than a traditional renewable back supply or REGO back supply. You've got that direct contract with a renewable source. And that also leads to that traceability. So there's a clear traceability of the flow of power and certificates from the generator to the customer. As I've said before, they're also pretty flexible. So the customer, maybe if it's signing up to a long-term arrangement, doesn't know where it's going to be consuming power in the next 10 to 15 years, but that doesn't really matter. It all flows through the grid to the customer. And then potentially there's potential for additionality. So if you're contracting with a new asset, then there's real and genuine claims that you've brought new renewables onto the grid mix. So that's pretty powerful in terms of messages out to the markets. And then volume and price security are also important. So if customers are making targets for their carbon consumption in 2040 and 2050, what a corporate PPA does, it gives you that long-term purchase of power, of renewable power, at an agreed volume and an agreed price as well. So there's plenty of security there. But for all these benefits, there are also some red lines and some challenges for customers. The long-term nature often takes customers out of their comfort zone. So a typical electricity supply agreement is 1 to 3 years. Most corporate PPAs are 10 to 15 years. And I guess with that comes a price risk. So there's some value in having a steady price, but also there's risk there that price may become out of the money during the life of the PPA, and the customer may end up spending more on its energy than some of its competitors in its market. I think volume's an issue, and has become an issue especially with COVID-19. We've seen a lot of our customers reduce volume or have to face volume reductions. And so when when a long-term corporate PPA is being signed, the customer needs to be mindful of how much it's not only consuming today, but how much it's going to be consuming over the course of that agreement. And then there's a complexity. So customers aren't used to doing PPAs in the same way that utilities are, or generators, and so there's complex contracts to get involved in. There's risks such as cannibalization and shaping that really is not part of their day-to-day bread and butter. So that can lead to significant lead times for internal sign-off, negotiation, and then you've got the build as well. If it's a new asset, then potentially, there's 6 to 12 months of internal sign-off negotiation, plus waiting a year or two for the asset to get built. And a lot of this involves costs. So you've got the setup costs of time, the time deployed, they're having the right people in your organization to dedicate themselves to setting up a corporate PPA, and also the use of specialist advisors and legal costs. And I think it's worth looking at the benchmarks. If you're putting yourself in a customer's shoes, and a customer who's been buying standard supply for a while, this is the benchmark to which they often make their decision about whether to enter into a corporate PPA or not. So a standard supply agreement, although it's simple and fairly basic, it can actually tick a lot of the boxes. So it will give you the right to report zero carbon with your electricity supply. It's low cost, it's very simple to do, it's very short term, so you don't have to get that sign off that you might do with a longer term deal. The lead time is very small because of the standard nature of the contracts, and you're normally signing up to regos from existing projects, and there's no minimum volume requirement. So most supply agreements are fairly flexible in terms of volume, so there's no overarching volume commitment there. But obviously, what you're not getting some of those value adds that you're getting with the corporate PPA. So there's no additionality, there's no claim that you're bringing extra renewables into the market. So authenticity and traceability are pretty low as well. You're not contracting directly with a renewable asset. You're getting the certificates that you happen to get from your supplier. And then clearly you're not getting the certainty either. So if you're signing up to a 1 to 3 year deal, when you come back to the market in 3 years' time, who's to say that renewable volume is going to be there, or is it going to be there at the right price? So what we're seeing, a lot of customers are happy to take the standard supply in order to meet their carbon requirements. A lot are coming to us and saying, actually, we want to do a little bit more than this. We want to do something more meaningful than a standard supply. But when they look at the corporate PPA and some of the red flags there, that's a little bit of a leap too far. So I think something we're always mindful of as a supplier, but also we think developers and generators need to be mindful of is how do we make corporate PPAs more attractive, not just to smaller customers, but to a wider market. And these are questions that are out there and are often debated and discussed, and we certainly don't have all the answers. But do we need to think about standardization? Do we need to think about aggregation of customers, or even generators, shorter tenors, so shorter terms? Do we need to think about bringing those contracts to a more kind of reasonable and acceptable timescale? And also, do we need to think about volume and price flexibility? And I think the aim here is to try and understand what makes a corporate PPA more attractive to more customers, so that we can get more deals done and more renewables off the ground. So like I say, I don't have the answers, but I'll leave you with those questions and hand on to the next presenter. Thank you very much.
From Beersom. I think I'm having trouble with the sound. No, I'm live. Okay, thank you. Have I shared my screen? Okay. Actually have put it into the, Joshua, would you be so kind to share the presentation that I sent you, because it is in present mode. Okay, I'll try again. Okay, if Josh is sharing my presentation, then I can focus on speaking. I think I'm sort of the Nordic alibi on this panel. I think the Nordic region has dominated the corporate PPA market for the last years. And in many ways, we are sort of proud to say that we have been a pioneer in this field. Norway has a long tradition for corporate PPAs related to our hydropower assets. And in recent years, the PPAs have evolved in correlation with the development of onshore wind. So we have sort of seen the entrance of new type of buyers and new type of sellers in the PPA market. In the slide here, I've listed some of the key Nordic corporate PPA drivers. First of all, we have sort of the Norwegian-Swedish renewable support system, which has been an important driver because it leaves the generator exposed to market risk, which is then and the incentives to sort of reduce that market risk through entering into long-term deals. This differs from many other countries where you have had sort of traditionally the feed-in tariffs and then shielding the generators from that market risk. Both Norway and Sweden have high quality wind resources with the highest load factors in Europe. This has reduced the project costs and also secured sort of the economic in the PPA deals. In addition, we are very blessed with our hydropower resources, which reduces the risk with wind power curtailment because you can use that hydropower availability when you have excess production. And additionally, most sort of wind projects in the Nordic have been partially financed with debt financing. And the PPAs have been sort of crucial to securing that long-term revenue and securing bankability. So there are almost none onshore projects in the Nordic without being backed by a PPA. On the demand side, we're fortunate to have sort of large industry, energy-intensive companies such as Norsk Hydro and Alcoa, who have shown an increasing willingness to enter into the PPAs, sort of to hedge their own price risk going forward. We have also seen demand come from large technology companies such as Google, Facebook, and Amazon, which is due to sort of our region's comparatively low electricity prices. So, and business sustainability is, of course, a motivating factor for these companies. So in general, we have the low power prices, which have established and created a good customer base for the PPAs. And we also seen then also a snowball effect over the last 3 or 4 years. You can go to the next slide, Joshua. With project finance onshore wind entering into the PPA mix, the complexity has also increased significantly. I included a slide here showing a typical project structure in Norway, and the slide could probably fill a separate webinar. And the purpose here is merely to illustrate this complexity, the various interests which are involved in these projects, and also the interfaces which needs to be considered. This slide also shows why it may be challenging to bring a larger range of off-takers into the mix. The usual suspects, such as Norsk Hydro and Google, are familiar with and also comfortable with this setup. However, for a new off-taker coming in, that would sort of require considerable education and time and cost to get up to speed. And you would also use both internal resources, but also third-party advisors. And as I will get back to, one of the challenges going forward in the Nordic market is that the market is to a great extent sort of satisfied Many of the well-known off-takers have filled up their portfolio, and many companies have either or are close to hitting their renewable energy targets. Then you can go to the next slide, Joshua. I've also included a sort of simplified picture of a wind PPA contract. Again, I don't think my speaking slot sort of allows me to go into the details, but the purpose here is to show sort of key topics and risk factors which needs to be considered, mitigated, and included in the PPA, and which often are subject to time-consuming negotiations. We have seen attempts to standardize the PPA contracts in order to sort of speed up the process and mitigate transaction costs. At least from a Norwegian perspective, I think the experience so far is that although this is a helpful starting point, the key topics and risk factors are always subject to negotiations, and we more or less always end up with tailoring the PPAs to the specific parties and the risk profile in the project. Next slide, please. So moving on to some statistics. Scandinavia and Norway in particular had the highest PPA volume in 2018. And if we look at the numbers for 2019 and also the numbers that I've seen for 2020 so far, the trend seems to be that the Norwegian and Nordic PPA volume is going down and that other European countries are entering into the game. I think that there are several reasons why we see this. First of all, we had a very warm and wet winter in the Nordic, which led to sort of the weakest prices of the last decade. We saw negative prices for the first time, and this sort of curbed the appetite on the buyer side. Additionally, as I already mentioned, the market is to a great extent already satisfied with sort of the usual suspects of takers sort of entering out, at least on a short-term basis. Additionally, Norway will not accept any new projects to the El certificate scheme as of the end of next year. In addition, the regulatory framework for onshore wind is being updated, and there is now a cut-off date for the existing projects, which is also at the end of next year. So we see sort of a rush to commission new projects in the next year going ahead, and that could lead to additional PPAs being signed. But after that, we think that sort of the rate of wind development will slow significantly down, and so will also the PPAs attached with that. Then you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So looking at the future, I think an interesting discussion point, which sort of Andy also touched upon, is what are the trends and developments that we may face? The first question is sort of, will the PPA format change? I think we have already started to see, and we will continue to see, a trend where the duration is going down. We have been used to seeing 15 plus, and we now see 10 and even below 10. We may also see, at least in Norway, a bundling of wind and hydropower going forward. Wind has introduced a higher degree of unregulated power, and in certain Nordic price area, this sort of increases the demand for flexible power. So if you can bundle wind and hydropower, that would also increase the flexibility that many of the customers are demanding. A similar concept has sort of been introduced by Statkraft in Germany, where a common obstacle that many companies meet is that their energy consumption is not accurately matched by the generation from the renewable plants. So Statkraft has sort of announced a solution to this, which they call a 24/7 PPA. And by that solution, they sort of match the consumption from production with then generation in real time, where they then leverage wind and solar with hydropower. As mentioned, I think a major hurdle is that corporation phase is sort of entering into the market for the first time, sort of aligning their stakeholders and making that business case. This gets a lot easier the second time around, and we already see it, and we will see it going forward, that you will have repeat buyers with a higher sophistication of the PPA process. Standardization of contracts is key, and hopefully that innovation around PPA contracts will continue to sort of speed up that process, and then also reduce the costs. I think another key hurdle, which has always been there, is to get sort of these deals financed. And I think we expect to see more evolution in project financing, both on the developer side, but also PPA buyer financing. A tendency is also that the lenders may accept sort of a higher merchant risk. And my prediction is that when developers of subsidy-free projects are looking at the Nordic market going forward, they will be looking at other alternatives than locking in 100% of the output in a long-term PPA. And that's not because the PPA contract isn't working. It's merely because the price that they now achieve is very low due to the fact that this is a very dominant PPA buyer market. So we might see financial hedging products included in the portfolio together with a PPA, with then a shorter duration and less secured volume, maybe a 60-40 split. So in that way, you could sort of complement the hedging options and then diversify the risk. Will the buyer types change? We have already seen sort of multiple off-takers through the Dutch wind consortium. We think that those are replicable models, and we will probably see them going forward. Sort of bundling of smaller companies acting as one off-taker provides sort of a solution to one of the biggest challenges that we have, meaning the imbalance between suppliers and credit-worthy off-takers. Going forward in the Nordic, we will hopefully also see new types of energy-intensive industries, both sort of battery industry and data centers allocated in Norway may or will hopefully be part of a new off-taker pool. And then last but not least, we have been speaking about it for 2 years, and we presume that insurance products will come to mitigate sort of the counterparty risk, which is a key concern among the finance teams. So that was, I think I went well over my time. But I hear that John is now with us, so I will pass back to John.
Well, I don't look much like John. I'm Judith Patton, and was sitting backstage waiting, hearing that John is back in. I must apologize, ladies and gentlemen, for the technical problems that are happening. Oh, life goes so smoothly until one tangles with this sort of thing. And once we relax, it comes and gets us. Svanhild, tusen tack. That was absolutely fascinating. If it slightly depressing, I feel, from your point of view, but great that data centers might save the day. Perhaps they could save this day too. Without more ado, I would like to introduce James Brabham, He is wholesale manager at Cornwall Insight and leads their work on cross renewables, flexibility, and wholesale power markets. So, James, can I pass over to you? And we are in the lap of gods, who will take over after you.
No worries. Thank you, Judith. Hopefully you can hear me okay as well. I will just try with the technical stuff that's going on to share my screen as well, and it looks like that is working, so that's great. So yeah, thanks very much, and hello to everybody on the line as well. So just to give a bit of a background to myself and also Cornwall Insight before I touch on what we're going to talk about in my presentation today. So yeah, James Brabham, wholesale manager at Cornwall. Judith's given me a really nice introduction, which is great. So just on Cornwall quickly, a very funnily named company, named after our founder, who's called Mr. Cornwall. We're actually HQ'd in Norwich, off the other side of the country in East Anglia, and we've got offices in London, Dublin, and Australia now as well. So we provide consultancy and regulatory services to people across the value chain in all of those markets, and really go into the guts and the complexity of market rules and regulations and licensing. So what I've got as a presentation very briefly today is a bit of an overview of our experiences in the market. We've worked on a number of different corporate PPAs and deals, and most of my work at Cornwall has been on that in my 6 years there. So I've got some views on where we see the market developing, and a bit like Andy was saying earlier, maybe not all the answers, but probably some other questions as well on how the market could develop in the future. So the main bit of my presentation is just this graph, to be honest, and hopefully it explains a lot of what I want to talk about. So we see it in GB at the moment that there's a lot of activity in corporate PPAs. There has been, especially the last 2 years, but corporate PPAs have been around for at least 10 or 15 years in GB. And what we've aimed to do, and what I'm trying to show here, is just to give an idea of what I would call the kind of imbalance in the market at the moment. And what we mean by that is effectively there's far more generators looking for corporate PPAs than creditworthy and applicable and kind of applicable corporates that can support that. So we've done some kind of assessments and analysis on this to say, well, what does that actually look like? Because that's our gut feeling, but what does it actually look like in the market? So I'll bring up these first two bars. What we started with was, okay, in GB, based on some older data we had, what is the typical demand of private sector RE100 companies in GB? So if you're not familiar with the RE100, it's basically a kind of group, and people pledge to that group to basically say at a certain point in future, I'm going to source 100% green electricity for my business. So we've just included basically large FTSE listed or stock exchange listed companies with activities in GB with a view on their demand. It's quite low. It's probably in about 4 or 5% of total GB demand, and I'll come on to why we've chosen that level later. And that's the blue bar there. And what I've also got is the fact that, in a good way, we've already got a lot of those RE100 companies signed up to corporate PPAs. The number of that increases slightly over the period you can see we've done here, probably including some of the deals we'll talk about later with Tesco, but others involved as well. So that's where we are currently in GB. We've got some corporate PPAs in place with RE100 other companies, and there's a base there of 10 terawatt hours almost of RE100 demand. Large-scale corporates probably looking for corporate PPAs or some sort of green supply in GB. Now, what we've also done is then map out from our own renewable pipeline tracker. So we take all the databases of public data on planning, grid, National Grid's tech register, the DNO registers, to try and work out what's in the pipeline, which is obviously useful for us at the moment as more people develop subsidy-free. And they're much harder to track because they don't go on RO or FIT or CFD registers. So we've then analysed all of those sites, and we tier them into a structure, which we have kind of 5 tiers. The top one being most likely to develop because they're more mature, they've got a route to market in place, they've got grid and planning, they might have a subsidy as well. So onshore renewables, this is mostly solar and wind. You can see here our kind of view of the development of that in the next 4 to 5 years is effectively cumulatively. By 2024, you're going to have about 17.5, 18 terawatt hours of new renewables probably come on the system, in our view. And that's on the basis of when those projects have said we're going to build or likely to build and so on. So you can already see there that I talked about the imbalance. There's potentially double the number of generators by volume than applicable private sector creditworthy corporates in this stack. And if I add offshore wind to this picture, and it's delayed slightly till 2022 mainly because of the CFD round being slightly staggered. This is on the basis mostly of new CFD projects and others. You've got a further 25 terawatt hours. So about 45 terawatt hours of new generation likely to come on in the next 4 years in our current view, against, as I said, maybe 10 terawatt hours of creditworthy corporate demand. And just to add to that, and I know I'm not painting a rosy picture, but this is the statistics. New offshore wind developments, if you look at the total pipeline of what could come on by 2030, is 80 terawatt hours cumulatively, so another 65, 55 on top of what we're showing there. And new onshore wind and solar developments could total a further 7 or 8 terawatt hours, 22 terawatt hours in total. So there's a lot of renewables coming onto the system, many of them without a great degree of flexibility on their routes to markets. Many of them are looking at corporate PPAs because there's a lack of alternatives. And obviously, as you can see, there are a big imbalance between supply and demand. One final thing, just before I do talk about the positives a bit more and what could be done, is the numbers there are probably too low to actually get us to net zero. So although those numbers look very high, the numbers, the outturn, the deployment rates are well off what we need to get to net zero. And if you've read future energy scenarios recently, National Grid have effectively said in their net zero scenarios, you need, I think it's between 2 and 3 gigawatts of new renewables every year from now to 2050. So if policy changes, if the CFD is opened up, if more things change to push renewables, that number could be even higher. So there's a big imbalance there, and building on some of the things that Andrew talked about earlier as well, I just thought I'd highlight that it's not all doom and gloom. There are possibilities for corporate PPAs. So what can be done to get that balance addressed? And I suppose twofold really: help more people get involved in corporate PPAs, but really why most people I'm sure on the line is understand how renewables can get deployed to meet net zero and how corporate PPAs can help that. So I've got a few examples here of some things that we often talk about with people in the sector. Sometimes we talk with government too when we ask them about these different things as well. One, of course, is I've left out a big chunk of demand in my graph, probably to make it look better, but also to note that it's a difficult one to track. Public sector demand. So loads of the public sector, and I've looked at the base stats from last year, and it's at least 60 terawatt hours I can see of public sector demand there that you can add up, and it's probably more than that, to be honest. Could well be incentivized to get into the corporate PPA environment. We've already seen some corporate PPAs signed with councils and local authorities, and I think many of them, I'm sure probably now the majority of councils in GB have set themselves either renewables pledges, net zero targets, some of them, and real tough net zero energy targets in 2030 rather than 2050 as the national target is. So a lot to be done by them, and a big sector there that I think could be supported by corporate PPAs. Others have mentioned it, but the smaller business sector, what could be done to incentivise the 100 terawatt hours or so at least of SME sector demand that could well be supported by corporate PPAs, or may want to join the corporate PPA market and become greener. There's obviously a lot of concerns around credit and offtake and those kind of things, but I think there's some good examples in other markets where perhaps supply chains are part of a corporate PPA, so you can have a large corporate with a credit rating who's stable and creditworthy as the backer, with smaller supply chain companies latching onto that deal. I know Budweiser have looked at that recently in the UK as well. Just one going back in time almost is obligations. So at the moment, it's obviously, as we were talking about before, very much a choice. It's very much a choice that corporates choose to sign with green power. They don't have to. They can sign green tariffs with REGOs and avoid the complexity of PPAs. They can just take the mix from the market and look for a low price. If it was really to be incentivised, it's a bit more radical, but could obligations work? We have some obligations on some big end users, and climate change agreements spring to mind. But I think there's probably good examples from history. So we used to have a scheme called the levy exemption certificates, which was basically a rebate if you could avoid using, or if you could prove you were using green power, and you would avoid what was called the CCL, which is still in existence, the Climate Change Levy. The paradox now, because that was removed in 2015, is you could pay the CCL if you're 100% coal-fired consumption, if anybody was, or you'd pay the CCL if you're 100% green. So there's some obligations there that could be used from the past to say, well, how about a rebate or a saving if you were to buy green power rather than a cost? And I know there's also been talk of REGO market reform and whether that could work as well. I think, to be honest, one of the big ones that we definitely advocate at Cornwall as a real solution to this market problem is credible alternatives to corporate PPAs. So I think what's happening at the moment is every generator who maybe can't go for another route to market, and really the only others are the CFD, which is going to be incredibly competitive next year, or utility PPA, is everybody's going for the corporate deal, as I said, and there's that big imbalance. So having credible alternatives, I think, actually makes the corporate PPA market stronger, because it means the appropriate generators go for their best appropriate route to market. And also you probably stop potentially the problem of misaligned or bad deals that could put off people in the future from signing a corporate PPA. If there's a scare story around the wrong price, the wrong tenure, the wrong volumes, issues around additionality, whatever it might be, with it being signed. So we actually think appropriate alternatives to the corporate PPA would actually help the corporate PPA market, because it means the right projects would come forward and do that. So I'm sure I've raised more questions than answers there, and I'm sure there'll be questions in the session as well. But I hope that sheds some light on what we see as the current corporate PPA market and what some of the challenges are. And I'm happy to hand back to either Judith or John for the next speaker too.
Hi, well, thank you very much. Our next two speakers are Ronan Lamb and Alex Ashby. Ronan is a legal director at Pinsent Masons, and Alex is head of treasury at Tesco. I've had the pleasure of dealing with both of them on a corporate PPA, and I have to say, although it might get me fired in my job as a partner in a competing law firm, I have to say that Ronan and Alex were an absolute pleasure to deal with, because they approach things in a very pragmatic and commercially sensible way in the context of the Tesco transaction I was involved in. And I think that's very important, because one of the things we need to do in the renewable sector is keep a very keen eye on costs. And I'm afraid to say legal costs are costs too. So over to Alex and Ronan to give us their perspective on matters.
Cool, thanks, John. That's great. Apparently my slides have an issue there. 1 second. Do they look okay now, Josh, or not? Okay, very good. Sorry about that. I thought better to start off on the right foot. So thank you very much for having me today. So I'm here to give a bit of context. I do hope most people know about Tesco. If you haven't heard of us, we are the largest retailer in the UK. And I'm here to give a bit of context, a bit of perspective from the corporate side, to go alongside those others from the panel you've heard from so far. And obviously, we're sharing this with Ronan, who has been supporting Tesco and knows an awful lot more than I do about PPAs, and we'll share some learnings from our process. So overall, Tesco joined RE100, which James introduced a little bit earlier, in 2017. We were and are the first global corporate to set a climate change target based on a 1.5 degree trajectory in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. And our environment team worked very hard to set a set of targets I'll walk you through very shortly, but mainly focusing on electricity due to the prominence of that in terms of our emissions. Overall, on that note, Tesco is one of the largest UK energy consumers, and we are around 1% of total UK demand, around 2.4 terawatt hours in the UK, more as a group. And to date, we are 68% renewable by our definitions. And if you have seen, we have some ongoing divestment subject to approvals of our Asian and Poland businesses that, if approved, will make us 100% renewable with a mix of certificates and PPAs. So moving on to our renewables roadmap and targets. So there are 4 elements here. We have obviously the red bit, non-renewable electricity, orange being certificates. So these are largely REGOs in the UK, or GOOs in Europe, as they're known. We have grid power purchase agreements, PPAs, in the green, and then we have on-site generation in the blue, which is where we're trying to generate our own electricity on our large property estate around the Tesco group. I guess, first of all, why those percentages? I guess in terms of on-site, the principle is we're trying to maximize this. Unfortunately, as such a large energy user, we can only credibly generate a relatively small proportion of our own demand using our estate, and what we can do, largely solar PV. And that means a very large proportion of what we're going to be seeking is going to be through power purchase agreements, which we have largely worked on so far in the UK, and we've been trying to lead and demonstrate that this is the right route for large corporates and RE100 members. And we are similarly intending to replicate across international markets where we have the principle that we want to try and generate electricity, renewables, where we do our business and where we operate as a group. So those are the targets. Hopefully you can see quite challenging and quite stretching, as you see from the demand. If we multiply up 40% and 50%, which is the ultimate target, I mean, that end target in PPA terms is 0.5% of all demand in the UK. So how have we approached this, and what have we been doing? Just to take you through a few bits of our approach and some learnings. Overall, we've for the first thing we did really was to approach this internally to make sure we had appropriate sponsorship. So I think, as Andy and others have mentioned, price risk, competitive advantage, and tenor are all absolute concerns at a board level that one must face into when you're going after something of this scale. Similarly, working with the board, we need to make sure we understand the risk management piece. There's an awful lot of risks, again touched on by the other speakers, where we've got regulatory risk, price risk, even counterparty risk when working with developers. We also have, one of the learnings was to try and get some delegated authority done. I think going up to the board, as everyone appreciates, is rather a long process requiring quite a lot of internal stakeholder management as well as formality. And similarly, when most people are approaching boards with up to maybe 2 pages, it's pretty hard to get across the detail required when you have such a broad strategy and broad commitments as required to get multi-year, multi-project PPAs away in the UK and other markets. We've managed to work this through and get that, and that enables us to have more focused discussions with some delegated signatories that approve our deals, and obviously feed that back regularly to the Tesco exec and the board. And I guess for me, another key learning, as always, is to try and avoid jargon, simplify the decision making wherever possible, and get the decisions across and the summaries across in a format that your stakeholders will understand and appreciate, while obviously managing the risk and complexity that underpins these big deals. And finally, one other thing we've done is establishing a diverse steering committee. This includes members from environment, treasury, finance, property from the on-site generation side, and really making sure we have regular dialogue where we're able to chew through ideas. This is not a well-trodden path. We should be debating regularly. Are we on track? Is our approach right? And how are we managing it? So moving on to the external approach, we launched a large RFP, request for proposal, late 2018. At the time, it was the largest corporate PPA tender in the UK, or that we were aware of. And we had 32 suppliers sign up, offering over 10 times the volumes we needed at that time, which were focused on our 2020 targets. We've managed the contract development and negotiation, and Ronan will be talking you through a little bit more detail of that and the learnings we have from that process. But the ultimate end game is that we've got 10 new build additional projects in flight, 7 signed, 3 underway. And us, as Tesco, committing to these deals has enabled the CapEx, a sizable amount of CapEx for these to be built, as well as eventually 90,000 tonnes of carbon saving per annum once they're all up and running. And we are continuing to build and work with the developer partners. We've unlocked the RFP and since to unlock and understand the pipelines. I think James walked you through that earlier, as well as seeking to innovate and see if we can improve or adapt and work on any of the structures we've done, particularly around risk management. And now I'll hand you over to Ronan to talk a little bit more detail.
That's great. Thanks, Alex. So as Alex mentioned, it's been a really successful procurement process so far for Tesco. And we wanted to, I think in the last few slides here, just cover a few of the sort of issues that sort of typically come up on a corporate PPA negotiation, and then sort of follow up and leave you with some lessons learned from this process and other processes certainly that we've been involved in. The project management piece is a really key piece, and Alex sort of mentioned that stakeholder engagement effort that a large off-taker has to go into. It really shouldn't be underestimated. How time-consuming some of this can be. In terms of large processes like this, where you're running multiple negotiations at the same time, it can draw a lot of resource from the internal team within the corporate, and also obviously amongst advisors, and in the sleeved model that certainly Tesco's used. You rely quite a lot on your supplier. So Andy's team at EDF needed to input a lot of time and effort into the process as well. So getting a kind of clear process in place early to understand exactly how you're going to run those multiple negotiations, how you're going to assess comments that are coming back at you from generators, and ensure that you're not taking the heat out of the negotiations is a really important thing to get right. We addressed it with Alex's team by sort of focusing on the kind of the key points first. We're now sort of using heads of terms and getting those agreed kind of early with developers, so that there's really no surprises when you get to the negotiation stage, and that works well. Getting into the contractual elements, quite a few things to think about here, and I've really just flagged a few of the most important ones. The predominant model in the UK for corporate PPAs has been the sleeved or physical PPA model, which effectively puts the corporate in the middle, sitting between the developer on the one hand and a sleeving counterparty or a supplier on the other. And in essence, what happens is the off-taker signs one PPA with the generator, and then tries to mirror that PPA with another PPA with the sleeving counterparty. The model works really well. It's well understood in the market, and it's a really bankable model. But what's really important to understand with it is who is best placed to take risks and to assume obligations in that model. And in reality, for all sorts of different reasons, the corporate often isn't the best person to take most of those obligations. It doesn't have a dedicated team of people committed to a particular project, or steeped in electricity industry knowledge always. So you're looking to leverage the knowledge that's within the supplier and within the generator, and essentially getting the parties who can best satisfy obligations to keep those. So there's a real exercise to be done by the off-taker to make sure that anything it's signing up to, effectively it can either satisfy, or the supplier or generator can satisfy on its behalf. The next point on change of control is one that comes up on corporate PPA negotiations quite routinely. The reason we mention it is because there can be a slight tension between the developer on the one hand, who wants to sort of maintain flexibility to recycle capital potentially and sell its project down the line, and the off-taker who has done its diligence on that developer on day one and is content to remain in a long-term contract with it. There is that tension there potentially around what's going to happen with that asset in the future. again, the way of dealing with it, and certainly the way we would always recommend clients deal with it, is to have a conversation up front. From the off-taker's perspective, from the corporate's perspective, to understand and ask those questions to the developer. What is your long-term strategy with this asset? Are you going to hold it? Are you going to look to sell it? If you're going to sell it, what sort of categories of people are you sort of looking to have the flexibility to sell it to? So an upfront conversation is required on that. And then staying with that theme of flexibility, for a corporate, and as I think Andy mentioned earlier, the typical supply contract that a corporate will enter into is a much shorter time frame than a corporate PPA. So sort of that 1 to 3 to 4 years time frame is typical, whereas your PPA is probably 10 to 15 years or longer. So it's really important to make sure that the corporate PPA is a portable product, and by that I mean that it's not going to preclude the corporate from retendering its supply contract 3 years down the line. It's something that is sufficiently straightforward and easy to understand that it could be moved from one supplier to another. So that was obviously important for Alex and his team. And then sort of moving on to kind of asset specific points. Obviously, from a corporate, you need to do quite a lot of diligence around the developer and around the projects, and we'll mention a little bit about that on the next slide. Most of these PPAs that Tesco were entered into early enough in the project's life cycle, so pre FID. And that obviously is super important for the developers, because the reality is that the PPA here is is the economic underpinning of the project, and it really signals that the project should go forward, and sort of allows the developer essentially to take that final commitment to the project once everything else kind of falls into place. That said, obviously, from Tesco's perspective, there are carbon reduction targets to hit, and that's the reason it's entering into the PPAs. So that there needs to be some certainty that those volumes will be delivered, and so you build in requirements in the PPA to address what is required when. In terms of approvals, and again, it comes back to the relationship with the developer and the dialogue that is really important in these arrangements, so you understand exactly what's going to happen when. Project delays are somewhat inevitable. 2020 has been a tough year for lots of certainly our developer clients. Lots of sites shut down due to COVID-19. Mercifully, a lot of that delay on construction projects is hopefully behind us. But delays, do arise, and how are they managed? It's important to understand exactly what the project timeline is like, and to set key dates within the PPA that are aligned with a reasonable construction timetable, allowing some flex for acceptable levels of project delays, but also ensuring that there are incentives built into the contracts to keep the developers keen and maintaining confidence from the corporate side that the power will be delivered when it requires it to meet targets. So if we go on to the next slide, we just focus on and leave you with a few lessons learned. Risk of repeating ourselves, the stakeholder engagement piece is just so important. We have had a few instances, not on the Tesco process, but on other processes in the market over the years, where both acting for developers and lenders and off-takers, where we've seen corporate PPA processes either fall by the wayside or be quite severely delayed because an key internal stakeholder has not been engaged until the last minute, and asks difficult questions which can't be easily answered. So engaging identifying exactly whose input is required early, engaging them and getting their support is really important. We've seen successful processes invariably have really high level support. So CFO support, board level, really does make a difference in just steering a path through the decision making process internally. It's really important for the corporate to understand what the external environment in the market is. And this is a place where I think some of the advisors in the market can really add value. Large corporates are often not as au fait with market norms and developments as others in the market are. And it is an ever evolving and changing market. There are constantly new developments, new market entrants, and it's important to understand what the sort of the lie of the land is. In launching a large procurement process, it's obviously quite a lot to get right, but one of the sort of key things to do is sort of understand what else is happening in the market at the same time. Is there another large corporate looking to launch a process a week before you, which could be difficult. So having your ear to the ground and sort of trying to get as much market intel as you can is important. And obviously you're making sure you don't launch around the time of an auction process, for instance, or government auction, because otherwise you might be competing for the same projects. That point about sort of market knowledge, I think, is also relevant in terms of kind of understanding what the counterparty landscape is like, and what the sort of expectations are going to be from the developer community for the product that you're proposing. We've certainly seen some off-takers come to the market with some very aggressive terms, and that can be counterproductive, because ultimately the developer needs to get all of that through internally, which can be tricky, but at the same time that will ultimately be trying to develop a bankable project, so informed by what the senior lender community requires, and so I think you're far better off as a corporate having a good eye on what is ultimately acceptable to the market and what is bankable before you put a product out there. Bid deliverability and counterparty credibility is really important. I think when we look at the caliber of the developers that the Tesco have contracted with to date, that was a really key element for them, was ensuring that the parties that they contracted with had a really good track record, and it certainly wasn't a decision that was based purely on price. An ability to actually get a deal done and get an excellent project built within a reasonable timescale was very important to Tesco. And that point about off-taker credit strength is an important one. It's probably issue number one on any developer or senior lender's list. When a corporate PPA opportunity comes to mind, what is the off-taker's credit worthiness? Is it investment grade? Is it not? If it's not, is it offering credit support? And if so, what is it offering? From a corporate's perspective, sometimes offering PCGs and things like that can be quite difficult. So it's an issue to consider upfront, and again to have dialogue between developer and off-taker from the very start. And then lastly, just looking at how do you sort of maximize the benefit of this process from a corporate's perspective. The various different ways of doing it. Running technology agnostic tenders and looking for pricing against multiple tenors, I think just gives you the benefit of seeing the full spread of the market and full spread of options that are available. Especially in a large procurement process like this, it gives you the option to sort of create a portfolio effect in what you ultimately look for and sign up to. And again, just in terms of running an efficient process, I think understanding generators' positions on those key terms, we mentioned some of them above, from the outset is really important. So, in running a procurement process, I certainly encourage clients to be asking developers to confirm, their positions against some of these key issues. It will just make the process of actually negotiating the PPA a bit less painful in the long term. So that they were the kind of key lessons learned we wanted to leave you with. But just to say, I mean, it's been a great process to be involved in so far. Obviously, quite a few people on this call have had roles in it in one way or another. And I think on one of the earlier slides, Alex showed the ambitions which Tesco has and the targets which it has. Looking at 2025 and 2030. So I think you're going to see Tesco as a very present counterparty in the offtake market for the next decade to come. So I think that's all we wanted to go through. So I think hopefully we can go back to John.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ronan and Alex. That was absolutely super. And I think one of the main lessons that we can draw from that is Tesco's have shown us that it's possible for an innovative corporate to really provide a great deal of support to the renewable industry at a time when there wasn't so much CFD and other support knocking around. So I think that's really the key lesson, is an exciting one that large corporates can provide a great deal of support to renewables. We're now going to move on to the questions. We've got about 25 minutes for questions, and I know we've got a large audience. I was going to start with a wee poll question, which I think the All Energy people will be able to help us out with. And the first poll question is to the audience is: how likely do you think it is that offshore projects will be developed without state support, for example, a CFD, over the next 5 years? And the choice is between likely being answer number 1, not sure being answer number 2, or unlikely being number 3. So that's a poll question, and we'll see how the questions come back to that. We've got all our speakers back, which is super. So I guess we'll put out some questions to the audience. Does the audience have any questions? And whilst the audience think about questions, I suppose one of the common themes to all the discussions we've been having about this is how do we broaden out the pool of off-takers in a way that remains bankable? I mean, Ronan's spot on. We need to, off-takers need to be bankable, because that's what lenders look at. So I was just going to put it out to the panel as to any ideas to broaden the pool of off-takers beyond the large corporates, perhaps to more medium-sized enterprises and so on. If they've got any ideas as to how that could be achieved. Rather than put someone on the spot, I'll look for a volunteer first, I think.
Happy to take this one as a supplier who talks to many customers. I think this the biggest challenge talking to customers and our sales teams is the tenor, is the length of the deal. That's just not, as I said in my presentation and came up again, it's just not in the comfort zone for corporates. And I think especially in the current environment where we've seen a lot of uncertainty over the last 6 months, I think let's put that front of mind. So I guess it's maybe on the developer side, and we obviously engage with the developer community as well. But if there's any flexibility over that length of deal, then I think that would make it a lot more palatable to customers. So I think most developers are looking for 10 to 15 years. I think sort of 5 to 10 years. I get the impression from many customers we speak to that could be more palatable, although it's outside of the current kind of typical supply agreement. I think it's kind of bringing it down into line with perhaps their medium-term plans. So I think that's number one. I guess making the whole process more transactional as well. So the whole again, it's been talked about a lot, especially by Ronan. That's kind of six to 9 months of negotiation time and all those kind of risks you have to consider. If that can be standardized, and whether we're talking about a standardized document or a process such that can be kind of boiled down and made more understandable for customers, and perhaps some of the risks taken away. So yeah, making it more transactional and reducing the term, I think, are the key things.
Yeah, getting to a more transactional basis would take out a lot of cost, and there's no doubt that that's something that could be very helpful. I suspect as people learn about how the risks can be fairly and reasonably allocated, that's something else that will help as well. I don't know if there's any other contributions to that, Svanhild or Ronan, for instance.
I think the point I think that James mentioned earlier is worth just kind of coming back to, about the ability for corporates to take their supply chain along, and sort of, there's a kind of an education piece that corporates can do with their supply chain, and also probably a kind of a soft pressure piece as well to get them to to do their bit. And I think Svanhild mentioned the Dutch wind consortium structure, which is a really interesting structure. We're seeing that in a number of markets, and I think it has been seen in the UK in the university sector. Club PPAs are definitely a possibility, and a model that I think we will see more of. So I think that's something that some of the corporates that have been on this journey already could definitely be leading on.
And Svanhild, anything to add to that? Although I think you may be on mute.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be my technical. I think I agree with both. Key is sort of to get the tenor down. And also, I think to bundle several off-takers in the Nordic and in Norway specifically, that will primarily hit sort of the private sector. I think we are sort of blessed with the fact that the electricity which runs through our grid is green. So we don't see that incentive in the public sector to enter into sort of corporate PPAs in the same way as you probably have in the UK.
Okay, that's super. And James?
Yeah, no, I think just building on the other points that have been mentioned around the supply chain stuff. So I suppose just to give an example, really, from other markets, I know Google have done it in the US, where they've looked to almost be what they call the kind of anchor corporate in a deal like that, and bring smaller companies into that framework. I think it's more difficult in GB, I have to admit, because of the lack of perhaps super large creditworthy corporates willing to take that risk. But you could potentially see it with if heavy industry or industrials go that way and try and become greener, and then perhaps people on their same industrial park or facility could be included in a deal. The other one, as I said, which I don't think would answer Andy's question of perhaps shortening the timescales, although I agree, I think that would be brilliant, is getting the public sector involved, as I said, in some way to be able to do that. Now, they might not have the credit rating, as it were, but something around using their position, as it were, and their I suppose financial strength in a way, and longevity to help sign more corporate PPAs, especially in an environment where they're trying to be greener, would be really good.
Yeah, no, I think there's a lot in. I have to say, I think there's a lot in that. And when you talk to people in the public sector, getting the public sector aligned to this agenda isn't always the simplest. Just first of all, let's go to the poll results. The first question was, how likely do you think it is that offshore projects will be developed without state support over the next 5 years? Likely 44%, not sure 25%, unlikely 30%. That's actually the likely number there is pretty high. That's higher than I thought it would be. So that's a wee surprise for me. But it does show the sorts of discussions we're having today, and things like corporate PPAs and just pure merchant plays are becoming much more credible in the marketplace. Now, an audience question, and this is something I think that's well worth engaging with. It's a good question. The question that's asked is, from an off-taker's point of view, what consideration do off-takers consider from the point of view of the generator being a green company in the public's eye? What value do they ascribe to, if you like, the reputational, if you like, positives that come from being associated with having a low or zero carbon supply chain for their energy? And I guess that kind of is something that falls into something I was thinking about, which is a general discussion about the importance of reputation in this context. So maybe start with Alex. I think you're probably best placed to help us with that.
Yeah, of course, John. Thank you. No, and something very, very topical for us, and it's a great question. I think for me, ultimately, most large corporates and companies out there do have sustainability programs. It's absolutely core now, and I think there's been even more focus, literally in the past 6 or 12 months on this. I mean, Tesco have had a broader sustainability program, not just on energy, for a very long time. Our Little Helps plan, which focuses on people, products, planet, and places, and obviously as part of planet, environment, and our renewable targets and ambitions sit. But I think overall, for me, it's something that really most corporates and businesses should be thinking how they can do it, and there really is a lot of talk and effort in this area. I would echo though the comments from the panel on the difficulties of supply chains following, but that means it's even more important for RE100 corporates and others to lead in this space and really drive forward. And I think the question was also on really, how one can look or measure that. And I think, look, you need to test the markets really. I'm sure investors, be it equity or debt investors in your business, your stakeholder groups, NGOs you work with. Tesco have a partnership with the World Wildlife Federation, which started a few years ago, was regularly in engagement. So I think for me, there's not an algorithm or rule for testing it, but you should be aware of your place and position in the market amongst your competitors and just generally globally amongst the world, and where you want to be. Do you want to be leading or not? And there are many other good ways of looking at it. I've recently started doing some work with accounting for sustainability, who are very, very far ahead in thinking around how one can actually try and bring commitments, carbon and other things into budgeting. So I recommend others do that, or a bit of research as well if they want to try and quantify this.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that is coming along the train tracks, and I've been involved in people who are looking at that as well, how you properly account for carbon emissions through your supply chain. And if you're ahead of the game, I think that will put you in a much stronger position over the next 5 to 10 years, because everyone's looking at this from an investment point of view. The next question I have here is maybe one for Ronan, and I'd be interested in Svanhild's perspective from across the water as well, is what do we take the view as being market change of control provisions at the moment? What do you think is market in this context?
Yeah, I'll maybe jump in first there, if that's okay. I think it's a tricky one. It's hard to say exactly what's market. I think you see a really wide range of change and control restrictions in corporate PPAs, ranging from the pure, consent, through, restrictions around, change and control to, entities that don't meet a financial, equivalence to what was there on day one. That's often part of the test. I think that there are some off-takers who, and certainly Svanhild, I'm sure, will be familiar with this in the Norwegian market in particular, who have a because of the sort of the political nature of the ownership, have restrictions on investments in in certain categories of the economy, and so hence wouldn't want to see a developer acquired by somebody who would contravene that. So it's hard to say that there is a market position. I think it's quite dependent on the off-taker and what it really cares about and what its ownership structure is like. I think the critical thing is to have an upfront discussion with the developer to understand, is its model to hold this asset long term, or is it to build and flip, and if so, what flexibility is it looking for?
Svanhild, you see across the North Sea.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a difficult question to answer. I think depending on which side of the table you're on, you're always going to argue that there is a standard. I think obviously you need to ensure flexibility. We see a lot of investment funds going into Norwegian wind power, and they're not going to sit on the projects for 15, 20 years. I think what we usually see are requirements linked around sort of financial and technical competence, sort of minimum requirements needed to be met in order to sort of not being able to deny a change of control, and also sort of a stapling concept between the asset and the PPA to make sure that you can never split the PPA from the asset itself.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense to me. And I think one of the things I think is becoming more of a focus is reputation as well. People are very conscious of being associated with the right sort of body and not necessarily being associated with the wrong sort of body. So that's something else, which of course is more subjective, but equally very, very important. The next question's an interesting one, and I suspect probably the best home for this is James and Alex, is do you still see a place in the next 5 to 10 years for community scale, it's kind of 1 to 15 megawatt generation projects in the corporate PPA market? Or do you see them being squeezed out by larger offshore projects on price or onshore projects? So maybe start with James and then move on to Alex for that.
Yeah, happy to come in there. So I suppose from personal experience, research, a bit of background noise, isn't there? Okay. Anyway, yeah, most of the ones we've worked on have actually been probably between 10 and 30 megawatts, I suppose, in size, maybe 10 to 50 megawatt size projects. And I can see that continuing for a couple of reasons, really. One is that a lot of corporate GB actually don't have, although they're big blue chip companies, they might not actually have the real super high demand level. So a good example might be a bank or something like that that's got a huge, revenue and business case, but as an energy intensive is relatively low. So I think we could see things like that coming through for those type of companies in the smaller market, and as said, councils local as well. I can see why people are maybe concerned if they are an onshore solar developer with the threat of large offshore and getting cheaper all the time, and the technology is getting better. However, I think it is difficult for one corporate to sign up with an offshore wind farm unless the offshore wind farm sold its power in chunks or tranches to different people. It would take a really big corporate, in my view, to take on that power. So yeah, I definitely think there's still a market in the short term in the smaller projects.
Brilliant, James. Thanks. That's very helpful. Alex, what do you think?
Yeah, thanks, John. No, I hope so. I mean, I think for me, look, absolutely the focus right now is on large assets, large procurements, and so on. But I think, we saw, and I think some of the names I saw earlier on some of the slides have done portions of projects and so on. There's nothing wrong with doing a slice of a project. I think for us, we're trying to lead, and we're typically signing up for all the offtake as our demand is so great. But we have a very large supply chain, as I'm sure people can appreciate. And as others have talked about, one of our aspirations is to work with them as well to become more renewable. So, I really do hope there will be smaller scale projects or more divisibility in the future to be able to support their ambitions and get forward. One of the biggest concerns people have is the scale and the tenors and so on, as people have mentioned so far when I've talked to our supply base. So I do hope that there continue to be smaller availability of projects, although obviously there is economies of scale when there are quite large setup and capex costs to get these things away. So inevitably that's always going to play through into economics and price, but things keep getting cheaper and cheaper. So long may it continue.
Yeah, and I guess another interesting side to that is just the fact that we're going to have quite a few sites coming up for repowering that will be smaller over the next, 10 years, and they'll be good sites with the modern technology that a lot can be done with. So I think that was a great question. The next question is definitely forward looking. Will we get to standardized PPAs that could be tradable in some way on some sort of exchange as being a part of the market in the future? I suspect the alternative to that would be people providing hedging products, for example, banks. But just interested in some views on that. Maybe start with James for that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to touch on that. I think there's a few people who've put contracts out there. I think it's EFET, I think they're called, who've tried to put out a standardized corporate PPA structure, structure rather for Europe or for people to use. There's obviously the kind of platforms that people are using now as well to try and matchmake with corporates and generators, which I think will help. But I think it's probably still some way off going that way, because ultimately someone's got to take on that risk of the trade, as it were. Now, obviously, the corporate has been attractive for generators because ultimately off-takers don't have the ability sometimes to trade off or hedge off that risk for more than 5-year fixed prices with the liquidity of the power market. So I'd probably say I'm hopeful that it could happen, but I think the first step would be the standardisation of the contracts, perhaps, and the tender process before you got to it being a tradable commodity, perhaps. But I know some people have looked at it in more developed markets like the US. I don't know if we've seen it in the Nordics too. But yeah, I think that's a difficult one, to be honest. James, do you have any views on that? Sorry, Andy, rather.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think there have been efforts, and we've seen the EFET documents. I think ultimately the developer is looking for a bankable PPA, and different developers and different funders have different views as to what that looks like. So I think having a standard document is quite a challenge. So I think where we've seen some of the exchanges crop up, I think that's more for the tendering process rather than the contractual process itself.
Okay, that makes sense. A question here: should the UK government legislate that public sector organisations should take an element of their electricity supplies from corporate PPAs? I guess I hate to mention the Brexit word, but of course, if state aid rules change, then maybe there would be more scope for that sort of legislation. I just wonder what people think about that. Maybe start there with Ronan.
Yeah, it's a really interesting idea, and I think there are plenty of jurisdictions that are looking at how they incentivize more corporate PPAs, and whether that's mandating them for certain categories of off-takers. I know certainly looking at the Irish market, where there's a government target to have, I think, 15% of power be supported by corporate PPAs by 2030. There's a real piece of work going on at the moment to work out how can that be made a reality, and whether it's mandating, whether it's through the tax treatment, whether it's a rates reduction or something. If you do it, I think there's a range of different ways of incentivizing these structures. And some of the slightly softer ones actually might be potentially could be used ahead of actually sort of requiring them to do so. I mean, I think public bodies at the moment have quite a lot going on. It's there's obviously there's distinct advantages to corporate PPAs, and maybe we just need to sell some of those advantages a little bit more, rather than sort of just coming in and saying, no, you've got to do this. But it's definitely, I think, as James mentioned, it feels like quite an untapped source of PPAs.
I wonder whether there's a lot in what Alex said about how this is accounted for as well. And I think more generally, I think the way we tax carbon and the way we put costs of decarbonisation on electricity probably is something that really needs looked at. And I know that the Committee on Climate Change is certainly very interested in that particular point as well. So there is a lot to be said for that as well. So I agree, Ronan. I think you're picking up some themes there that should be top of people's lists at base. Now, we've only got 2 minutes left. And first of all, I'll apologise for your audience on two counts. First of all, for my late joining, which was due to Wi-Fi stroke IT issues on my part. I made the fatal mistake of coming into the centre of Glasgow to do this. But also to apologise to the audience, because you've put in a lot of really, really good questions. We've not even scratched the surface of the questions, which shows what an engaging and important topic this is. I also should thank all of our panelists, who I think have been absolutely super, and certainly I've learned a lot listening to the panelists today. And finally, I should also remind you all that you can find all the All Energy webinars on the All Energy website, and indeed you can share this webinar with your contacts and colleagues as well. So there's some links put up on the screen now. So I'd like to thank the people at All Energy for organising this, Judith and the team, but also thank Andy, Svanhild, James, Ronan and Alex, who I think have been absolutely super panelists. So thank you very much.